Yeah, Eddie here, carrying on talking about soundscapes, walks, everyday life. And now we're going to talk about the practice of everyday life by Michel de Certeau, specifically the chapter Walking in the City, which is a very big work in cultural studies. So I don't know if you guys like the ideas here and you like this course in general. I really encourage you guys to carry on in cultural studies, critical theory, etc., etc. But essentially, this work aims to chart out and detail the ways we resist dominant forms of control put upon us by modern society. And in the practice of everyday life, which is the book Walking in the City is part of, Certeau develops two core terms at the start of his book: strategies and tactics. And yeah, I could give a whole nother lecture on this. So just to keep things, brief, I'll say that strategies are the normative ways of doing things as imposed on society, while tactics are the ways we play with the norm, resisting the dominant order through creatively playing with the rules of the system. Right? So strategies are, I don't know, like the roads which make cars drive a certain speed, and tactics are like walking, which is the main theme of the chapter I've had you read, is about. And this might be one of the most famous chapters of the book, and I'm really excited to have you guys read it. And if you guys haven't read it yet, or you've tried to read it, it's really confusing. I hope in giving this lecture, you guys will understand the general principles more, and you guys can try to tackle it again and really feel the way the words change you or speak to you. Anyways, so Toach starts the chapter off by describing what it's like to see New York from above on top of the World Trade Center. And before, Anyways, so from this total bird's eye point of view, we get a transcendental perspective of the city, and he calls this the view of a voyeur, which will differ from the perspective of the walker he will later advocate for, right? The voyeur sees the city at a distance, as one would if they saw the city from above, but in doing so, they see the city as a whole. For Certeau, the city planners of a city constructed from a bird's eye point of view, but this view ends up missing the lived practice of a space, but down below, right? So this transcendental point of view that the voyeur sees ultimately pins down meaning, making and freezing the plural mobilities of the masses into what he says static transparencies. It immobilizes its opaque mobility in the transparent text. So what does that mean? Basically, this is a way to say that when we view something as a whole, when we view something from above, where the people look like ants, the possibility of a place, become pinned down and flattened. The dynamic life of those people living around us, viewed from above, becomes simplified into just the mass movement of moving ants. The inner complexity and the everyday mobilities of people is made alien to the voyeur. The voyeur, quote, must disentangle himself from the murky, intertwining daily behaviors and makes himself alien to them, right? Viewed from above, you're alien from the day-to-day lived life from below. Meaning becomes less negotiable. The landscapes are these unchanging works that appear to be impervious to change, whereas on the ground, things are always changing based off the micro everyday interactions of living life, right? From above, things may seem static and stuck. A building may seem like it's always going to be there, but from below, you'll notice things are always changing. Things are always in movement. Changes happening all the time. And importantly, this is Certeau's message. This change doesn't have to only happen from, a group of elite bourgeois who get to decide everything. This change can happen to the everyday civilian, who he calls the hero of this book. It's dedicated to the heroes the unknown heroes, the everyday civilian who just lives their life, and in living their life and in being mindful in living their life, they can actually end up renegotiating the streets day by day. So obviously the question is how? How do the day-to-day actions of the dwellers of a city renegotiate the space of that city? The tactics, and this is through tactics, and this is through the figure of the walker, right? So the walker is compared against the voyeur, and Certeau will compare readers to slow down here. So the walker is compared to the voyeur, and the way Certeau is going to make his comparison is through this argument by language, which sounds very strange. But essentially, Certeau will compare readers to speakers, and he'll say that to read is to be passive, while to speak is to engage in the active transformation of something. And so in that way, he'll say that walkers do not read because they do not view from above. They're these sort of blind, he'll say they're blind like lovers in each other's arms. But walking is a form of speaking and of writing, not of reading, not of passivity, but of speaking, active transformation of some base material. Why? Because walking is a form of writing that ends up creating a new story in the city. Walking overwrites the normative reading of a city to create a new alternative story. Okay, so what does speaking have to do with walking? What does writing and speaking have to do with walking, actually? This is where we can then frame Certeau in a larger general theoretical movement. So he's part of this movement we call post-structuralism, part of it, which emphasizes the radical potential of language and of thinking of language. So for post-structuralists, language and writing in particular is a tool that can rebuild and reconfigure the society we live in. The argument's very simple. Language structures our reality, so if we change our language, we change our reality. That's basically it. We use language as a tool to change reality. And this is actually something both Certeau and Barthes are concerned with right? They're both concerned with this question of how we can rethink our normative relationship with something. For Barthes, it's how we can reconfigure our relationship to the language of music, or language regarding music through the grain. And for Certeau, in a similar sense, we can develop a new language of living in the city, through our acts of walking. Walking offers us a new language of engaging in everyday life. And in doing so, this new walking language ends up reconfiguring the city we live in. And actually, if any of you are interested, the secondary literature on Certeau suggests that he has a need to elevate writing and speaking as a mode of praxis and revolutionary action, in part because he wants to see his own work as revolutionary. And this is part of a whole tradition of leftist thought, which even Marx was a part of, which positions writing as a radical act. But so it comes down to but basically the idea is the way we think, speak, and write about something ends up framing the experience of that something. So speaking about writing, or in Barthes' case, music, ends up shaping our experience of walking. And by shaping we speak about walking, and that shapes our experience of walking. And then shaping that experience of walking, we also open up a space to resist normative structures of walking and existing in the cities. Right? We open up modes of resistance in our participation of activities such as walking and really thinking about it. Okay, so maybe we have to establish some stakes. Why does it matter? Why do we need to restructure the city through walking? And here we should understand more of how Certeau posits the city, or at least the negative aspects of the city. So Certeau follows through Foucault's notion of power, if any of you are familiar with that, but if not, it's okay. But the basic idea here is that the city wants to push itself to self-produce itself endlessly, and that the organizing logic of the city in neoliberal capitalism is that the city can continue to be a city, right? Neoliberal capitalism's goal is to self-perpetuate itself again and again. So city design accounts for some flexibility of mobility, some change within the system, but only insofar as that change can be reintegrated into the system. So there's no large-scale overthrow of society, right? We can think of the various protests that have occurred in the past 10 years, right? Occupy, Black Lives Matters, the pipeline protests. All of these have been met with so much resistance because they're revolutionary actions against the status quo. And so the control society doesn't like that, and so they'll try to shut it down. Meanwhile, protests like the trucker one can basically be go on for a ridiculously long time because it's non-revolutionary. It doesn't threaten anything, right? But when the city or the control society or the entirety of control society feels threatened in any way, it's going to employ a system of violence, like the police, to prevent and squash that change. Or it's going to use neoliberal mechanisms of mobility. The famous quote here is, capitalism is a vampire, to absorb the radicality of a movement and reintegrate it into a safe sort of neoliberal perspective of, we care about diversity, but we won't change the root problems of class inequality, essentially. But anyways, before I get into that, Certeau's intervention into this kind of thinking, and he's someone who witnessed revolution with May 68, and I can't get too much into that now, but basically Certeau isn't so much a revolutionary who wants to overthrow the system, though he does care about that. Instead, he's interested in the ways minor gestures such as walking can change and sort of overthrow the system from within. Certeau believes in part that radical revolution occurs in the everyday gestures that make dents in the system, right? So the idea here is, so far, the city exercises power over its members. There's what Certeau calls a functionalist totalitarianism that keeps control over city dwellers, right? So I'm sure no matter what city you've lived in, what town you've lived in, you recognize there are a bunch of policies in the city which do not actually benefit the majority of people who live in there, right? There are a bunch of policies in the city which are being made for the profit of a select few. There are so many unreasonable, unrational choices which come into city planning, which make it less inhabitable to everyday civilians. So why is that the case? It's because the city can act as a method of control, and right? And what Certeau says, though, is there's one flaw in this design of control. And for Certeau, he writes, by privileging progress, i.e. time, this causes the condition of its own possibility, space itself, to be forgotten. Space thus becomes the blind spot of a scientific and political technology. Put again, society exercises control over us by controlling our sense of time. The 24-hour day is sectioned off into 8 hours of work, 2 hours of commuting, and whatever. And on the macro level, modern society gives us a pathway as to how we should live life, right? We should be X age when we marry. We should be Y age when we have a house. There are road marks in life which we're expected to hit time and time again, right? So, right, on the day-to-day, time is being controlled and organized by modern society. In our whole personal life, time is being controlled. We have these expectations and norms put on us. And even more generally, in society itself, society presents itself as this endless machine of progress. The technology is always progressing and getting better. The stock market is always growing. I mean, like, not right now, but, it's supposed to always be growing. And when it isn't, that's a bad thing for some reason. But anyways, we as humanity are always progressing. Or, to say the least, the rich are always progressing, and the gap between rich and poor is ever increasing. But the point is, we resist the functionalist totalitarianism of a city and the hostile design of it through space, because space is not what is totally controlled by the regime of functionalist control. Urban life offers resistance to the city project through walking, in part because of the impossibility to administer walking. The functionalist administration can't fully administer our walking, and so we still exercise agency in it. Not like, for example, the ways, we work under capitalism and are alienated from our labor, right? In walking, we have a lot of control of where we go, what we do, and how we can affect the city we live in. There's the famous metaphor for walking of two paths diverge already has built into it the possibility of choice. Or as Certeau can say, we can try another path, we can try another path. So anyways, like, Certeau is pointing out this tension between collective modes of administration and an individual move of reappropriation, quote, right? So society at large aims to administer and determine the lives of its individuals, but the individual can reappropriate the messaging of society as an act of resistance. Society in general often only extends control over the individual through messaging put through time, right? The pressure to start a family, buy a house, get upwards mobile job, whatever. All of this stuff is imposed to us through society as a linear progression of an individual life. But society can't really tell us how we engage in space. It can try to by telling us not to walk here or go there, but we have a lot more freedom engaging in space, right? Like, I know a lot of people who are on the quote-unquote well-worn path of life in the terms of temporality, but who in terms of space can be quite rebellious. They go to places they're not supposed to. They jaywalk, they do all these, whatever stuff. And, like, space offers this palace of rebellion. Walking becomes what Certeau calls the tricky and stubborn procedure that eludes discipline. It's never outside the logic of the city or the power of the city, but it eludes the mechanisms of control. Walking can't be contained. Precisely because it can't be contained, does walking secretly structure the determining conditions of social life. Quote, put again, the ways walking changes society are hidden, right? It's a hidden restructuring. The intertwined paths of walkers give shape to spaces in ways the voyeur city designer simply can't anticipate, right? The shape of a space, the meaning of a space only emerge in the day-to-day lives of the inhabitants in that space. And as a result, the city cannot control where walkers go to and from. Right? We can't bound where we walk. It has this open mobility in a system that aims to compress us into categories. So anyways, I want to return to this theme of walking and speaking I was speaking about earlier. So Certeau further charts a theory of speaking. Walking is like speaking insofar as it takes an already established system and appropriates it to make it the speaker's own. When we speak a language, we take the base material of a language and imbue it with our own personality, with our own dictum, our genosound, so to speak, right? In speaking a language, we always make it our own, in part. We make poetry out of words. And here I want us to have, a more broader view of speaking. On the one hand, speaking is a gesture that plants us within language, but on the other hand, speaking is just sound making. And a lot of you guys talked about this in your essays, so I'm sure you already know it already. But when we speak, when we enunciate, we make sounds. Even when we're walking, our footprints make sounds. I know, we're talking about walking right now, but we always have to remember sound is always being produced in walks. And this is why Walking the City is such an important text in the development of sound walks as a discipline, and in part why we're reading it in the course on sound, actually. But we have to be mindful that our footsteps make just as much sound as any other gesture. And this is part of the way we enunciate a new language, and we reconfigure space. Reconfigure space through sound, right? The voyeur, and this is a difference between the walker and the voyeur. The voyeur who looks at the world from above does not hear the world. This transcendence of experience from above, which we might say is from the perspective of a God, precludes one of the core abilities of transcendence, the ability to properly listen to everything going on in the ground. When one is up above as a human, you can't listen to what is going on the ground. It's just this wall of noise, it's a lo-fi acoustic environment, as we were talking about last time in soundscapes. So the immobility of meaning that occurs from above the World Trade Center, in part, is formed by the way sound cannot move into the voyeur's ears. That's a moment of tension which cannot be, broken through. But meanwhile, the walker down below is in the midst of sound, and that sound is transforming the environment of the footsteps, right? Certeau starts its section which introduces the radicality of walking through the language of a chorus, the chorus of footsteps. And so with this established, and with our ears aware of the sonic aspects of speaking, I want to talk about how walking is a space of enunciation. It's a place where we can write and rewrite the norms of the city. The city becomes the vowels and vocabulary for the poetry that can be produced in walking. Certeau actually describes walking as a lawn poem that manipulates spatial organization. And I think it's insightful to think of walking as a lawn poem. In our day-to-day walks, we make a story. What happens in the walk was something totally singular to the path we took at a certain time. The dog we saw, the seesaw made of wood planks, the direction of the wind. These are part of the lawn poem of the walk we're making. These are singular acts which only existed when we walked, and which we in part co-created in that walk. This is something you could try next time you walk, and if you wanted to, you could even write a poem about it afterwards. But you'll notice every walk is singular. Anyways, so walking ends up becoming the spatial acting out of the place, meaning that it makes real and mobile a city which before was just immobile and for the use of business. The dominant system of a city wants to control our walking and wants to walk to places where we can spend money, be consumers, or which doesn't disturb the endless threats of progress of our urban system, right? We can look at the ways in which the capitalist dystopia wants us always to just be indoors on VR headsets or whatever. But the thing is, Certeau points out, of course, that it's true that a spatial order organizes an ensemble of possibilities, i.e. places one cannot move, and interdictions, i.e. like a wall that prevents one from going further, which is to say that it's true that society does in fact control both where we can walk and where we cannot walk, but that's only to a degree. For the walker, Certeau asserts, can actually actualize some of these possibilities, but in the way of actualizing them, he makes them emerge. He moves them and invents others, right? When the walker walks, the crossings, drifting aways, or improvisations of the walking ends up transforming and abandoning certain spatial elements. So, put again, walking can reinvent a place such that it is inhabited for other purposes that it is not originally intended to such a degree that this other purpose can become the socially dominant purpose. I'll put a clip of the movie Band of Outsiders out. And in that clip, you'll see that the three main characters decide to run through the Louvre to see how fast they can complete it. This kind of speed running relationship with the Louvre reinvents the place outside its normative function, which in the case of the Louvre is seeing art. If speed running museums becomes a trend, which I don't know how the internet is working out, but I wouldn't put it past us that suddenly became a trend, then this practice of just speed running museums, which is just a different way of engaging in the space of the museum, would end up making us feel differently about museums. Walking as a tactic is one form of living in a space where we reinvent the space of that space. So, like, those in psychology may recognize this malleability as what we call the theory of affordance. That is, the use of objects is malleable and there's no right way to use an object. The use of an object is dependent on our relationship with that object. For example, a heavy book which may be intended to be read could also be used as a door stopper. A cooking pot may be used as a drum set, and so forth and so on. It's similar with walking, right? The walker actualizes possibilities that have been prescribed by society, this path, that path, to some extent, but they can also increase the number of possibilities as well as make prohibitions to the dominant norms, right? They can increase the possibilities by doing things like running in a museum or taking shortcuts, detours, going to where you're not supposed to. And they can refuse the norm by making prohibitions. They can tell themselves to refuse to go down the well-trodden path. For example, this could be a challenge we can do to help us think outside the ways we think about walking. The next time you want to go somewhere, instead of taking the path Google Maps says you should go, try to take the weirdest path you can to the store, the park, or whatever you have. Avoid major streets, walk backwards. There's so much we can do with our legs and our bodies, right? So walking a bit strangely is how we discover the ways walking is a wandering, quote, of semantics. Okay, so let's sit with that phrase. Walking is a wandering of the semantics. But this brings us back to Barthes, right? That is, the mobility of walking also implies that the meaning of the walk cannot be easily fixed. It's always wandering. It's wandering. The semantics of walking is wandering insofar as walking is always about wandering. Walking destabilizes the fixed gesture. It connects with the grain insofar as the grain also resists this dominant semantics of order, of normativity. Walking and the grain are both ways of wandering and subverting the normal expectation of things. Certeau calls walking a forest of gestures, which manifests on the street. The way we walk, skipping, running, backwards, dancing, whatever, and the path we walk, the normative or the non-normative, becomes a forest. There's just so much complexity when we decide to walk and traverse three-dimensional space. It can't be tied down or pinned down the way a voyeur looking at the streets, looking at the people walking on top of a building would think so. The walker manifests a forest of gestures in the streets that cannot be captured by a larger design. There's so much room for improvisation, and it becomes in many ways an art form in and of itself, the art of walking, right? So let's go through an example. This is the example actually Certeau gives, right? For Certeau, by walking, meaning is dispersed in the hands of the walker, who has freedom to exist in a city outside its imposed semantic meaning. We can see this through proper names, or put another way, through street names, right? One mode of organization for a city is the street name, and how we plan a city is by the street. So here in Toronto, the city is built on a grid system of major streets such as Queen Street or College Street, and these streets are used by almost everyone living there, and they have a cultural and societational association to them. For example, Queen Street is seen as this more boutique shopping street. But on the private level, the meaning of the street changes based off the individual's personal experience with that street. For myself, for example, Queen Street may be known as a boutique shopping street, but for me, it's this place where I can go to Trinity Bellwoods and explore hidden alleys and also find cheap places to eat. It's this almost habitual street of affordable living. It's a place where Badminton Boys and the Java Cafe are. Which are two food locales which are pretty affordable and delicious. But this is a personal meaning that goes against the public meaning. Insofar as the dominant meaning is that Queen Street in general is more pricey, this personal meaning is that it's more cheap and, affordable. But this relationship with Queen Street I have in walking through it obviously is still under the logic of consumption, but there are ways I can still resist that logic of consumption. I can go down to Queen Street without ever spending a dime, right? I can go through Queen Street just to see the people walking by. I can go to see the graffiti alley with its beautiful artwork. I could just experience the textures of the road walking down it, right? And it's important to note that, as we started this lecture off and noting that the stakes are not just personal for Certeau. It's not just about reinventing our phenomenological experience. There's this deeply political aspect to his work. And so the question then is also how these cultural and societational associations change precisely through the ways the city dwellers inhabit the space. So like a great example, or one at least for me, is Vancouver's Richmond, right? Richmond and Vancouver is an area populated a lot by Asian people. And specifically, there's a big Chinese diaspora there. And it just so happens that this Chinese diaspora inhabits the space in a way which makes the place its own, to such extent that the proper name of many geographic landmarks or road signs have been attuned to the population that lives there. So, there's this controversy a few years back at how some of those signs in Richmond were only in Chinese, and this was a controversy because many people thought this excluded the English language, and it was threatening sort of to the sort of normative English hegemony that Canada has established itself as. But this is precisely the way in which Richmond provides a counter-narrative to the norm. It provides a counter-narrative to the English-dominated way of existing in Canada. And this sort of extends to the various towns which are in every city. Here in Toronto, Chinatown, Little Italy, Little Portugal, all these places are inhabited by inhabitants who everyday existence in the place has made that place a place of its own against the endless hammer of progress that demands apartment complexes be built everywhere all the time or whatever. And like new office buildings or whatever. Ultimately, the part of the aim of Certeau's project becomes, in this way, to show how the places we live in, cities, towns, what have you not, is not the static design created from above that we merely exist in with little control to organize, but that the city and place is constantly being negotiated by us through small everyday gestures like walking. Right? We, so to speak, make a place in our walks. Certeau emphasizes that in walking we can put a second poetic geographic meaning on top of the permitted and original meaning. We reinvent a place by walking through it. Okay, so what does this have to do with listening? Again, as I was saying, walking is not silent. The chorus of footsteps we hear are very much part of the radicality that can exist in the walk, right? The sounds we make in the walk, as well as the sounds we notice, are significant parts in the renegotiation of space a walk will impart. If you busk on a street enough, it will become a street known for busking. And I hope you saw last time the ways that soundscapes and landscapes are entangled to the root, right? The way a landscape progresses through the industrial, to the electrical revolution is deeply tied to the way the sounds of that landscape end up being developed, right? Sound and land, body and sound do not disconnect. And so the radicality of walking occurs just as much in the footsteps as in the path. Right, there's no, right, the sound is there in the path, it's incorporated in the path, right? So let's just say, like, in that way, there seems to be two primary ways in which sound walks renegotiate a space. First, in being attentive to what is around us sonically, what we end up what ends up happening is we perceive the everyday grains that are scattered around our lives a lot more, right? And these are grains, as we discussed about earlier, which desubjectivize us. But this desubjectivization is positive because our sense of self can now become reconfigured, so it's not so tied to the expectations of and norms of society. For example, I'm sure we've all had this experience of being beaten down by some kind of failure in life, academic, career, interpersonal, whatever. Like, sometimes we are reminded that we've failed as achievement subjects in capitalism, as subjects which are always just supposed to be succeeding and doing all the time. But what we can be reminded is that there's a lot more to this kind of interpolation and subjectivity. And we're reminded of that definitely in part just through attentively listening to the environment, right? Maybe a peaceful moment or a quiet walk where we hear the birds sing. We hear the waves of the water. We hear the bristle of the wind. We sort of, in these moments of attentive listening, we realize that the bustle of life will continue on, and all that is and will continue to be. We realize that the worries and failures we've had as subjects, achievement subjects, are small in the grand scale of things, and that there's much in life to take joy in. The grains of everyday sounds remind us of a world outside of ourselves and affirm to us and desubjectivize our sort of neuroses, and which torment us ultimately, right? So on the other hand, in the more social sense, the sounds we encounter in a walk are part and parcel of the force of gestures and the wandering semantics of the walk that destabilizes a space, right? So sounds, just as paths, can be normative or not, right? Normative sounds such as greetings, goodbyes, and apologies might dominate our walks, but non-normative sounds, such as singing or weird poetic words just being whispered on the streetcar, these restructure the experience of a space. This is what Schaefer talked a lot about in our readings last week. And we can see it again in Richmond, which has a certain East Asian spatiality to it because of the sounds of the Asian diaspora, right? Or diaspora, sorry. Of course, there's a speaking of language, which is a sound, but also the sounds of C-pop and J-pop, the sounds of Japanese video game music in the arcade and the mall, and so forth, create the landscape and therefore soundscape of the place's identity, of Richmond's identity. And by making these sounds, which are always being made, by making non-normative sounds, or by giving space for those sounds to exist in our consciousness, by noticing them, what ends up happening is that the space can end up going against the normative design imposed on it. So anyways, I hope in the sort of survey of Certeau's work and also Barth's work, what you're getting a sense of is that there's a way we can relate with the world through a position of non-mastery and of non-normative existence, and that this way already provides a new form of coexistence in everyday life, which is what we're going to conclude on when we talk a bit about how to live together, just briefly. But the whole point is, when we start listening in our sound walks to day-to-day gestures, we'll find very quickly that and this is bleeding a bit into the idiorhythm, but we'll find that the world around us have different senses of temporality, different rhythms to life. They have different, we realize in listening that there's a world outside of ourselves living life. And when we walk, we notice that the bird chirps are at a different rhythm than from normative capitalist time, right? This is something really cool if you guys didn't know, but if you slow down some bird sounds, you can hear a complete melody. The birds chirp so fast that you don't notice it when they chirp, but if you use technological equipment to record it and slow it down, you can start to see a whole melody emerge in the warbles. And these are like just different sonic spaces which are happening all the time, sonic rhythms which are floating in the air, which we encounter in our walks, and which already point that to a idiorhythmic sense of community which we are in, which we're going to briefly touch upon soon, but which I hope, I hope you guys are just coming to see the ways in which hearing in our sound walks allows us to perceive the grains which we encounter in the sound walks, and also which can connect us to rethinking our relationship with community in the sound walks, insofar as we become more attuned to the sounds the runner produces, the sounds the birds produce, the everyday sounds of life, which each have their own rhythm, and therefore which constitute a space not in a flattening experience of capitalistic progress, but of course of the expression of individuals which make community. But again, more of that soon. Anyways, yeah. See you guys soon.